In 2022, I began a project to recreate Colorado's Georgetown Loop as a 4x8 foot model railroad in HOn3 scale. I envisioned a condensed version of the loop that could run continuously on a small layout. After about 2 years of construction, this idea became a reality. This video will show the layout's progression and cover some technical mistakes and discoveries I made while working on it. The first step was constructing the Devil's Gate High Bridge. To replicate the bridge, I used the 210-foot steel viaduct kit by Micro Engineering. This bridge would dictate many important features of the layout, such as the radii of the curves and the base elevation of the roadbed. In reality, the track on the Georgetown Loop runs beneath one of the towers of the Devil's Gate High Bridge, but on a 4x8 layout, it would be impossible to climb the 11 or so inches necessary to reach the top of the bridge from the bottom over the course of approximately 12 feet in track length. The steepest grade that my Blackstone K27 could handle with a short consist was 3%, so the lowest level of track had to be elevated. The grade climbs only about 4.5 inches to reach the top of the bridge, but this is still a considerable increase of elevation for such a small space. 3 other bridges also had to be built, since my plans had the track crossing the creek 4 times. These smaller bridges were constructed from a Walters plate girder bridge set. Next, I bought some 4x8 foot pieces of insulation board to serve as the foundation for the layout. I used a couple of 3% Woodland Scenics incline sets to map out where the track would have to be laid in order to accommodate the broad bridge. I placed the top part of the bridge on some foam blocks, then pinned the pieces of the incline sets accordingly. Having sketched out where the track would run with a Sharpie, I removed the foam pieces and ran DCC wiring beneath the insulation board, installing drop wires that could connect to the track in various locations. The track was initially powered only by the NCE DCC power cab, but I later installed a toggle switch and connected a DC transformer to it so that both DC and DCC locomotives could run on the layout. At this point, it was time to build the grade and lay down the roadbed. I supported the bridge using foam columns that were painted to resemble concrete as seen on the railroad today. The grade had to be elevated about 6¼ inches for the aforementioned purpose of reducing the vertical distance between the bottom of the grade and the top of the bridge. In this photo, you can see the Woodland Scenics 4-inch risers on top of some pieces of foam and cork, which were used to achieve this purpose. 2 incline sets were required for this layout design, since the track had to both ascend to the top of the bridge and then come back down to the lower elevation. I also needed enough 4-inch risers to underlay the entire track plan, except in areas where bridges were present. Once the grade was complete, I glued down cork roadbed and began laying track. I primarily used Micro Engineering Code 70 HOn3 Flex Track. Small pins and Loctite power glue were utilized to secure the track, while CA glue was used to hold it down on the high bridge. As is customary on a DCC layout, the drop wires had to be soldered onto the track, and much of the track was soldered together at the joints as well. As the track was laid, I periodically tested the locomotive's ability to traverse each section, ensuring that there were enough drop wires connecting the track to the DCC wiring beneath the layout. The tight curves and overlapping nature of the design made laying track one of the most difficult and tedious parts of this build, but ultimately I was able to complete this phase and successfully run the train over the line. Once all the track and wiring was in place, it was time to form the foundation for the scenery. I crumpled packing paper into wads and used them to create hills and contours for the valley, as well as pieces of scrap foam. The corners of the layout were constructed from foam slabs. All of this would be covered by plaster cloth, which would ultimately serve as the base for further plaster work. During this phase, I scratch-built the entrance to the Lebanon Mine, which was constructed in the 1870s and still exists to this day. Although its location has changed considerably on my layout from where it is in reality, its inclusion makes the layout a little more identifiable. My entrance was constructed from small pieces of balsa wood purchased at Madison Hobby Stop, located in West Madison, Wisconsin. Once the whole layout had been covered in plaster cloth, it was time to start rock work. Since I was modeling the Georgetown Loop in its earlier days prior to 1939, a rockier appearance was appropriate. I mixed plaster and carved out some rock formations as the material dried using a putty knife. I also used dried fragments of plaster to represent smaller rocks. In some areas, my hand-carved plaster rocks looked fairly convincing, but in others they had an appearance that resembled melted butter. Sadly, some of these less desirable-looking formations ended up on the finished layout, but many were covered up by rock castings and sculptamold. Rubber retaining walls were placed in a couple areas during this phase. When all the plaster had dried and most of the cloth was covered, I began painting the layout. Selecting colors and a good texture for the paints took some trial and error, but ultimately I ended up mostly using Warm Gray by Master's Touch, Neutral Gray by Liquitex, Timeless Gray by Apple Barrel, and Granite Gray by Apple Barrel. A heavily diluted wash of Mars Black by Liquitex was used to highlight texture in the rock. Adding dirt and soil to any layout is key in achieving realistic scenery, and it was by adding these that I felt the layout really started to come alive. I used decomposed granite from Southwest Boulder and Stone Company to add small stones and provide a true rock-like texture to the scenery. I also sifted through some small rocks taken from a site near the real Georgetown Loop to provide soil and stones from the actual location. If I could redo this layout, I would have made sure to pour a thin layer of thinner soil over the layout before adding smaller stones. I ended up pouring fine soil and coarser rocks onto the landscape simultaneously, which created a rugged quality that is slightly out of scale, but is at least fairly natural looking. Medium and fine foliage from woodland scenics served to represent the vegetation on the loop. All the smaller rocks and plants were glued down with woodland scenics scenic cement. After a few months of not working on the railroad, I decided I wasn't satisfied with the appearance of many of my rock formations, particularly directly along the creek bed, and I sought to give them more dimension. I purchased several Woodland Scenics rock molds from Rocky Mountain N-Scale Supply located near Denver, Colorado, and began creating scores of rock casts. Many of these were broken up and were attached to existing surfaces with Sculptamold. To create a more uniform effect, Sculptamold was lathered between the plaster fragments, then smoothed out. This method created large rock formations that had a sense of shape and depth. I also purchased some coarse talc to represent the gray boulders that are present along several areas of the actual railroad today. To create forest areas, I got two sets of Woodland Scenics value pine trees. These trees were initially extremely dark in their appearance, so I coated them with fine yellow grass and burnt grass turf to lighten them and provide some texture. Each tree was individually glued down using Elmer's all-purpose glue. Along the real Georgetown Loop, a road once connected Georgetown to the mines in Silver Plume. To replicate this road, I used Sculptamold and some powder from Arizona Rock and Mineral. The path is a subtle indicator of human activity on a layout that generally emphasizes natural scenery, and also serves as an interesting point of visual interest that complements the railroad track. The final task to complete the layout was pouring Woodland Scenics realistic water into the creek bed. Before doing this, I poured a few drops of navy blue water tint into the realistic water to create some color contrast in the environment. Once the realistic water had dried, I brushed on gloss Mod Podge to represent texture and ripples in the water. In some areas, the realistic water did not collect well due to the unevenness of the creek bed. To remedy this issue, I pulled apart some cotton balls and placed them in these dry areas, then poured a bit of untinted realistic water over them. This gave the impression of rapids, and I also used cotton balls to depict tiny waterfalls in some places. Once the Mod Podge had dried, I brushed on a watered-down coat of white acrylic paint to highlight the texture of the water. In some spots, I dry brushed the white paint onto the surface to give the impression of whitewater rapids. All that was left to do was add some wildlife, and the layout was complete. I hope that this project provides some ideas and inspiration to anybody working on a model railroad, big or small. If this layout taught me anything, it's that mistakes can lead to a pleasant revelation or to a discovery of a previously unknown technique. Don't be afraid to embrace mistakes and experiment with how you might adapt to unintended outcomes. Who knows? Your project may turn out all the better for having had them. The important thing is to keep moving forward and to be flexible and creative. If you would like to learn more about this layout, as well as other activities going on in HOn3 scale, check out the 2023 HOn3 Annual from White River Productions. For now, I'll leave you with some footage and photos of the completed layout. Thank you all so much for watching, and happy modeling.